Kito, ein Musikpodcast für zwischendurch. Hi and welcome to the first episode of 2022 by the Kito Podcast. Kito is a student initiative at the Institute for Musicology at University Leipzig. We want to offer insights into the music scene of Leipzig and beyond. My name is Schönberg and I'm currently staying abroad as an exchange student at the Hobart and William Smith Colleges in the state of New York. Today I'm really excited to welcome Professor Olivieri. Hello.
Hi.
Would you like to introduce yourself a little?
Sure. My name is Mark Olivieri. I am an associate professor of music at Hobart and William Smith Colleges, where I have been since 2010. Prior to that, I was composer in residence, and I taught both undergraduate and graduate courses at the college at Brockport, and I also worked as an accompanist for the dance program there.
Great, we will come back to a few aspects of that.
Mm-hmm.
Before we go on, just a quick COVID disclaimer that we are both vaccinated and following the college's guidelines by being masked indoors in public spaces. Yes, I would like to start by shortly explaining how we know each other. So I took your music composition class last semester, and we will also talk more in depth about composition. But first, maybe you can tell us a little bit more about your education, where you started,
Sure.
And where you went.
Sure. My very first musical memory that I can remember was picking up a B.B. King cassette when I was about 7 or 8 years old. It was lying in my brother's room of all places. And I did not know who B.B. King was at that time, but of course, he's a very famous American blues musician. And I just remember playing that cassette to death. And I was just so intrigued by this new musical rhetoric that I had never heard before. Prior to that, my musical experience, of course, was like any other kid growing up in the States. You learn folk tunes in school, and I took piano lessons at a very early age. I think I started when I was 6 years old. And I sort of had a trajectory. I took lessons with what we joke around as the neighborhood piano teacher, right? And she was great in many aspects. She got me excited about making music and playing music, which I think is the job of any musical instructor. But at a certain point, I studied with her all throughout high school. Secondary school, until I was about 18 years old. And I played, the usual kind of repertoire, lots of Bach, lots of Beethoven and Brahms, and not a whole lot of 20th century repertoire, Chopin, all that stuff. And it wasn't until really I went to school, undergrad, at this place called Heidelberg College, a very small liberal arts college in Northwest Ohio. Very similar to Hobart and William Smith colleges, in fact. It's really small, 1,200 students. So I knew everyone by the time I was a senior.
Like
you kind of knew everyone there. But I went there because my piano teacher's cousin taught there. And he was one of the Van Cliburn piano competition, participants. So he was a really fine pianist, and I went out there to study with him. His name was Larry Blind, and I was really excited, and he was throwing all this new repertoire at me and names I'd never heard before, like Gina Stara, and I've of course heard of Debussy, but I hadn't played a whole lot, and Weber and all this new music. And at the end of my first year, he said, "I'm not coming back in the fall." And it was this moment. He took me out to eat. He was going to Albuquerque, New Mexico, to start his own school. But anyway, the point of that is that I only wanted to study piano performance with him. I was really young, and I'd went there for him. But the whole time, I was also composing, and I put this in sort of air quotes here, my own music, because I was never writing any of it down, really, with the exception of a waltz that I wrote in secondary school. But I was always kind of composing music in my head and playing it and improvising. And improvisation has been a huge part of my process. So I started studying composition. I took a composition seminar, and I really loved it. And I really didn't understand how much there was to know about composition. I just thought, we just kind of hear something and we write it down. But you're studying form and you're studying orchestration and all this great stuff. And I just found it really interesting, and I was just bit. I was bit by the bug. I just knew that is what I wanted to do. So I did. So I changed my major from piano performance to composition. And I graduated from Heidelberg College, and I won an assistantship at Ithaca College Music Conservatory, just an hour south down the road, to study composition with this person named Dana Wilson. And I did that for 2 years. And then I was, maybe 24, 25 years old. And I went back to Rochester, where I'm from, and I started teaching in the studio of the neighborhood piano teacher where I studied, and I was teaching piano lessons to primary aged kids all the way up through secondary school. And at the height of my lessons, I was teaching maybe like 65 to 70 lessons a week. I did that for a number of years. And then I took a job at the college at Brockport. And I think I told you how that even happened, right? So I was 25 years old, and I went back to a restaurant that I worked at in between undergrad and graduate school to visit some friends that I had worked with that were waiting tables. And there was a young woman there, and I was like, hey, who is...
Yes, I know the story.
And I asked my friends, I'm like, who is that? Because I was like, wow, this woman's very beautiful. And they said, oh, don't worry, but don't waste your time with her. And I said, well, that sounds like a challenge, right? And of course, I met her, and she said that she was a dancer. And I said, I'm a musician. We talked a little bit about that. And so she invited me out to play for her. Well, she improvised and I was improvising at the college at Brockport. And while I was improvising, the chair of the dance department, and this woman named Sandra Fraley, came in and said, oh, who's playing piano? This sounds very nice. And I said hi, I introduced myself, and she mentioned she was the chair of the department. And then she asked me the pivotal question, which was, have you ever accompanied for dance before? Now, I knew at that moment, right? I had already been through school and met a lot of composers, that through my mentors. And participated in conferences and met people, and I knew that she was about to offer me an opportunity, right? So, although I had never really formally played for dance, of course, what do you think I said? I was like, of course I have, right? But in my mind, it wasn't that far of a stretch, because my graduate assistantship was to accompany the opera and the musical at the conservatory. And so, I said, yeah. I said, of course. And she said, well, we're looking for a musician in the fall. Would you like to play? And I was like, well, I'm just as employable now as I was when I finished my undergraduate work. I'm like, absolutely, right? And so I knew zero about playing for dance. it ended up being one of the most important things, most pivotal things that I had ever done, because it took me about 2 years to really understand that you're not just playing a tempo, and a style. If you play ballet, yeah, you can open up some Schubert dances and stuff and kind of play through them, and then maybe improvise through the harmonies. But what you're really doing is helping support those dancers, right? You need to play music that inspires them, to make them want to dance, to make them get off the floor at the right time, right? Or to make them feel grounded, or whatever it is, the sort of dance aesthetic that the instructor is trying to have their students do. That's what you want to do musically. So they essentially paid me to learn for 2 years, which was quite gracious of them. And I did learn. I played with every musician that was there. A lot of percussionists, a lot of drummers, a really great jazz pianist, and fine musician, and they all just made me better. Every time I played with them, there was never a time in 11 years where I didn't walk away having learned something from playing class. Like every single class I learned something. But it ended up being really important in another way. And that was because you're playing things on the fly, right? You have sometimes 30 seconds. An instructor, a dance instructor, will show something to a student, and you watch it, and you have to go. Okay, are they in 3? Are they in 4? Are they in 6? What is the aesthetic of this? Is it bound? Is it quiet? Is it lively? And all that stuff. And then you had to go, and then you had to create something. And what I learned was, wow, that's a very organic way to think about creating music and writing music, right? Because I had been taught formally that, okay, here is your musical ideas, right? We write something, kind of like we did in composition seminar, where we have like a 4 or 5 note motive, and we say, what can we do with these notes, right?
Make more.
We reorder them. Yeah, right. There's octave displacement. There's an inversion of it. All sorts of things that we can do, right? And we see examples of that in the literature, right? But playing for dance and doing it so quickly and doing it on the fly was really liberating to me. This idea that, I can just improvise ideas in my head and just quickly write them down and get them down. Sometimes record them and transcribe them later. I had never studied that way. It wasn't something I did, although, you and I had joked around about this a little bit. My teacher, when I went into my weekly composition lessons, he would go, "Oh, hey, Olivieri, you could do something like this," and he'd be working on one of my string quartets. He'd be reading through it, and he goes, "Or you could do this, or you could do this, or you could do this." And like every idea was so interesting to me. I was like, how do I write that down? How do I remember
I
that?
can't do that. Exact same situation for me.
It was like information overload, right? And I think he was trying to teach me to do that. But there was still, and he was a great mentor, and I learned so much from him, and I'm so thankful for everything I learned. But there was a little bit of a disconnect between, hey, look, you can just improvise at the piano for a little bit and write that down, and then connect the dots later. Look at all your material. How does it make sense? Then you're constructing the piece, right? So composition, sure, it's about nuts and bolts, but I also learned that, like writing sometimes, you have all these ideas and they're kind of like all over the place, and then you have to sort of assemble it in a way that has continuity, in a way that makes sense, depending on what you want your formal structure to be, what you want, where, what your intentions for the piece are. And so I worked as a dance accompanist, I think, until from 98 to 1998, back in the 90s, until 2005. And then...
And was that all in Rochester?
It was, in a suburb of, the outskirts of Rochester, really, right? So there's Rochester in the city, and then there are all these, what we call the larger sort of metropolitan area. You have suburbs in Germany, right? Yeah.
Yes.
Do they have beer in Germany? So Brockport was this suburb, and it was only, half an hour from the city, right? So, when you go places, you just tell people you're from Rochester, you're working in Rochester. You don't say Brockport because no one knows where that is. So anyway, in 2005, because I was working for a state university, I decided to apply to do graduate work at sort of the flagship university in the state of New York, which is the University at Buffalo. Okay. And I applied, and I got into the program, and because I was working at a university, I went to school essentially on waivers. They financed my education, right? Because that was, a consideration, was like, how was I going to go back to do a PhD? How was I going to fund it? And at that time, 2005, I had 2 children, 2 young boys. And I thought, why not a better time? To go back and start a PhD when I already have a family. So I went back. I finished my PhD in composition. Again, I had a great mentor there. This guy named Court Lippy, who writes a lot of electronic music, electroacoustical music. And then I started applying for academic jobs because I knew that I wanted to teach. And I went on, maybe 5 or 6 interviews. And so, of course, and I don't know how they do it in Germany, but in the States, when you are a candidate for a position, they probably get over 100 applicants, right? Sometimes 200, sometimes 300 applicants if it's like a large research one university, right? And then they whittle it down to about 30, and then to 15, and then you're one of 3 or 4 applicants, and they bring you to campus. So I made it to the final 4 5 or 6 times, and each time I didn't get the position. But then there was a position here. They were looking for someone to fill in for a semester because there was actually a death in the department. And so I came in just to finish off the semester, I think like 6 weeks or something like that. And then they asked me if I might come back the next year to teach theory. And I said, sure. And so I did that for a year, and then a full-time position opened up, and I applied for that position. It was a straight-up theory position, which I was not really interested in.
It's a little bit dry.
Although I could do it, it would have required a little bit of work on my part to just kind of, I had to take all the theory for my degree in composition, of course. But I didn't think I had the pedagogical part of it, right? Well, I did not win that job, but then they created a position for me because they wanted to keep me here. Thank goodness, right? And I just thought that maybe I was going to get like a 3-year position, and it would buy me some time to go ahead and look for other gigs. But then they said, we want to create a tenure track position for you, and I was totally blown away. I was not expecting it at all. And so it was just one of those situations where I just happened to be in the right place at the right time. And of course, for me, it was amazing because I'm from Rochester, right? My wife is from Rochester. Both of our families are here. And so it was just incredible, confluence of events that happened for us to be here and stay here. And I was really lucky. So I've been here since 2010, where I teach courses in American popular music. So I'm the person that teaches history of rock and roll. I teach a jazz history course, and I teach 2 courses on hip hop. I teach a genealogy of hip hop course for upperclassmen, and then I teach a first year seminar called Hip Hop Culture.
Yeah, that's exactly where I'm gonna jump in right now.
Yeah.
How did that come to be, like?
The hip hop thing?
Do you need, like, to teach certain courses, you
Right.
probably need to have studied it before?
Yeah, sure.
So where did they
Yeah.
come in your studies?
Yeah, well, I'm as old as hip hop, right? So I'm about to turn 50 this year, right? So hip hop really developed out of the Bronx River District in the late 70s, right? And I remember being in school and listening to all those pioneers of hip hop, like DJ Kool Herc, Fat Boys, Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five, Run DMC. I mean, that was 6th grade for me, 5th, 6th, 7th grade. So I grew up listening to a lot of hip hop, and I went to school in the inner city, and that was just, it was really funny because I listened to 2 types of music. Well, I listened to every type, but at school, I had classmates that either listened to metal or hip hop, right? And then, Run DMC comes along and merges those 2 things with Aerosmith and stuff. But I was always fascinated with that music. Of course, it's one of America's great exports, right? The United States' great exports. We exported jazz to the rest of the world. We exported rock and roll. And, hip hop is another musical rhetoric that, started with African American culture and has been exported, And I find both the sociological and the musical aspects of that just fascinating. And so I wanted to understand it more from a sociological perspective, issues of race and culture, but also the commodification of the culture and commodification of the music and what that means. And so those are the kinds of things that I'm interested in exploring, and musically, how it's transformed, right? Because, we're getting into other things, but that is just to say that the music at one time was considered subversive.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It was like dangerous, right? And now hip hop is just so pervasive in our culture everywhere, right? So those are kinds of interesting things for me to investigate, and I like having those conversations with students because their understanding of hip hop is actually, I find it fascinating because they think that it is a real current music and that they grew up with it, and I'm like, well, no. No, this is my music, not your music. You can share it, but this is as old as I am, right? So.
Yeah, maybe we would need another whole episode just talking about hip hop.
Oh yeah, that'd be great. I love
because
talking about
when
it.
I talked to the Kito people last week, and we never had anything with hip hop on the podcast.
Oh, interesting.
So we were just like, do something about that.
So
maybe we will have to.
Is that an academic subdiscipline that you would study at conservatory in Germany? Did they talk about American? I mean, of course, jazz. You study jazz.
Yes.
But hip hop, is that?
Not at all, I think.
Not yet.
We have. There's people who concentrate on, to keep it very big, popular music.
Sure.
Like that's like the umbrella term maybe, but it's very little, and you only get taught if there's someone at your institute who specializes in it,
Right.
like with everything else. But it's so fascinating because jazz is really so established at this point at all the conservatories.
Sure.
For anything that goes into more popular music, there's different schools for it.
I see.
And at my institute, which is solely scholarly oriented, like just musicology, it really depends who's teaching right now.
Right. So you might not have an advisor who could mentor you about hip hop necessarily.
Yeah.
Right.
Like at our institute.
Maybe that's your
not at
niche.
all.
Maybe that's your niche. There's no one exists yet. That's yours. So, well, it's interesting because we talked a little bit about this I think we talked about this in composition, but I do feel that regardless of how you feel about that particular musical rhetoric, right, or schools of composition, let's say, right, there are people that are just sort of they're, I wouldn't say repulsed, but they're like, I don't want anything to do with minimalism, right, or this trend or that trend, which I think is silly, right? I love it all. Let's give it to me all, right? But we do have to sort of contend with hip hop, right? Like, in I think it was 2017, Kendrick Lamar, right? This hip hop artist wins the Pulitzer Prize in musical composition, right? He is adjudicated, with all these other quote unquote concert music composers, right? With this sort of traditional pedigree, the people that went to Yale and Princeton, right? These men and women that study at these universities, at these conservatories, that that composition is kind of this thing, and then all of a sudden, this hip hop artist comes along and says, no, but what happened in that case was the adjudicating body said there are already so many of these pieces that we felt were influenced by hip hop, that it made more sense to award it to the actual source music than maybe a simulacra of it. Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I think so. Absolutely.
I mean, also, like, why the hell not? Like, one of the big discussions also in musicology is the classification and what music is high and low, and that in the end it often doesn't even make sense a lot, but we come back to it regardless. We can't really let it go. That's such an interesting thing, I think.
Yeah, I've always been, my own personal take is that's silly, right? And I think I mentioned there's a story about Gershwin hanging out with Schönberg, right, at a reading of Pierrot Lunaire. And they listen to the piece, and of course Gershwin is like blown away by the colors and the sun, and just hearing that. Can you imagine hearing that for the first time?
No.
Holy shit, right? It would be like landing on Mars or something, right? Yeah. Kind of the way that hearing hip hop was for the first time for me, or hearing Nirvana for the first time, the band, right, from Pacific Northwest. But so he hears this piece, and after it's done, it was time for Gershwin to share some of his music, and he's feeling sort of sheepish about going up to the piano after hearing this great thing. He's got these songs, like, I Got Rhythm, and I don't know what songs he shared with them necessarily, but we know the kinds of tunes, right, quote unquote tunes that he wrote, and he's feeling sort of intimidated by this, and apparently Schönberg turns to Gershwin and says, "Herr Gershwin, music is music," right? Meaning that, hey man, we're just both doing our thing, right? We're both writing music. Like this idea Kurt Weill, same sort of thing, right? He had these two existences. Or I think even the film composer Eric Korngold kind of lived in both worlds.
Yeah, he did concert music
Yeah.
too.
I actually heard Milton Babbitt, who's whose music, do you know the composer Milton Babbitt, this American composer? He taught at Juilliard, whose music can only be defined as challenging, right? Part of that post-Darmstadt era school, right? But I heard he was like a huge fan of musicals, right? So you listen to his music and you're like, whoa, right? And then, he's going to watch Guys and Dolls or something, or Oklahoma, right? And we kind of tend to think of them as being in like these two separate worlds, but maybe not. Maybe there were things that he heard in those musicals that clearly influenced his own music, right?
That kind of leads us to composing directly.
Yeah.
I would like to talk very shortly about the Society for New Music.
Sure.
It's in Syracuse, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is another city around here.
Yep.
So what is the work of that society? How are you involved? And
yeah, sure. So the Society for New Music is a not-for-profit organization that champions the work of living composers, primarily in and around the upstate area. And by that I mean, this corridor of western central New York. Although there are some composers from the Hudson Valley, and occasionally we will program works of composers in the city, but of course New York has their own sort of musical organizations and Heartbeat and all that. But and so they commission composers. The director of that organization is a woman named Neva Pilgrim, who had a professional singing career for many years and now teaches voice at Colgate University. And I got involved originally through my friend Mark Mellitz, who's a composer that teaches at University of Illinois, Chicago. And I was still at Brockport, and I was doing all this work with dance. And many times I would play live, or I would write a little something, bring in some musicians from Eastman and do a piece. And I said to Mark, I said, hey, I have this idea. What would it be like if maybe we had 5 or 6 composers and 5 and 6 choreographers work together in the creation of new works specifically written for dance? And we use society composers and society musicians. And he thought, oh, that's really interesting idea. And not that it's anything novel, like people have been doing this for a long time, right? But nothing like it had existed around here yet. And Neva thought, okay, that sounds like a good idea. Let's try it out. And the first year, it was a production. Anytime you do something for the first time, it's like trying to figure it out, But it went over well, and it has been, since its inception, the inaugural concert. It's been the highest attended new music performances for the Society for New Music. I think partly because it draws both the dance audiences and the music audiences. The sheer number of people involved, right? So you have choreographers, you have the musicians, but you also have dancers, and each choreographer sometimes brings, maybe they're making a quartet, but maybe they have a large group piece, maybe they have 10 or 12 dancers. So you have all of their friends and family sometimes attend, and they, it helps to get the word out. So it's been pretty successful in that way.
Yeah, that's really helpful, because I guess that's the same here. It's sometimes challenging to find the people to listen or to attend for new works, which can be so frustrating, especially outside of the centers, right? In big cities, there are not people, like, you get people interested for everything.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like,
yeah.
someone will be interested, but...
It's funny. Yeah, that's right. If you go into New York, but the funny thing about a big city is it's so splintered, right?
Mm-hmm.
Those audiences are already so small, and so when there's a lot of new music, they kind of get splintered here and there. It's funny though that one of my favorite things to do still is I could go to new music concerts and spend a whole day in a concert hall and listen to new piece after new piece after new piece. A lot of people are like, oh my gosh, I gotta go listen to new music, right? But I just, there's something to me, even student works. I get so excited to hear what students are doing and what kind of ideas they're doing. And I hear stuff all the time that's really surprising and really innovative, and that I'm going to steal.
Yeah, I think for me, the composition course really helped me with maybe getting closer to getting pieces, or just getting closer to unravel them, because before I mostly had come in contact with it through lectures and just really someone talks and I listen.
Sure.
And I think with these pieces, you really have to get closer, because the accessibility, we talked about it in class, is not as easy or as immediate, but that doesn't mean that it can get built up or something like that. We just have to train ourselves maybe. And but it really helped me, like, a lot.
Yeah, the example that there are two things about that I think are interesting, right? Is that it's the pizza example, right? The difference between getting like a fast food pizza at a place like Pizza Hut, or having like a real artisan pizza, right? That took time to prepare, or just your taste and discrimination in food, right? It grows, right? So the more that you kind of understand it, you're able to sort of digest it, quite literally. But I think the second thing always to keep in mind when hearing new music that's really important, and I don't think we teach this enough, is, hey, what do I think, not what the piece is about, right? Because that doesn't really matter, right? That's sort of interesting to have your sort of own internal narrative, but I think it's more interesting to ask, wow, what do I think the intention of this composer for this piece was? Because even if a piece doesn't necessarily move me, on some sort of visceral level, I can still say, wow, that's interesting. I see what they're working with, what the tools are, what the compositional tools are that they're putting together to make this thing work. Like when we looked at a piece, a really abstract piece, like Threnody for the Victims of Hiroshima, right? The first time anyone hears that, they're like, what is going on? Like all this cacophony, right? But then you realize, there's some real careful planning to that piece, right? And sometimes the pieces that we hear as the most abstract, I would argue that those are the ones that have to sort of be kind of put together, not carefully crafted, right? Not all the time, of course, right? But if we just ask, what do I think the intention of this composer is? I think it makes the listening much more palatable.
So, would you say it comes together, like teaching how to listen comes with teaching how to compose? Because that was kind of one of the questions I wanted to ask. Is it possible to teach composing? Which is such a funny question, I guess, because obviously you studied it and you teach it.
Yeah.
But how would you answer that question?
Yeah, there's it's fun. We didn't read it in our class, but there is this composer, I think his name is Orlando Jacinta. He taught at University of Miami, and he wrote this essay titled "Can We Teach Composition?" Right, and I think I think we can, obviously, right? I believe we can. I think oftentimes, and you've heard me say this in our class, is when I look at material and I see seemingly unrelated material or material that doesn't come back, right? If I just say, okay, does this material develop? Does this material develop? Where does this idea go? You're doing this really cool thing for 4 bars and it's gone, right? Why not do it for 40 bars instead of 4, right? And then, if we open up any Mozart sonata, for goodness sakes, right? I mean, and we just read through and listen to it, and we hear the development of ideas. It's not like, we have a first theme and a second theme, and they develop them in the development section, right? And sometimes a closing theme. And so, it's learning how to strategies and ways that you can get more mileage out of this material, right? You heard me say that tons of times, like
a few times.
Yeah, I might have said that a few times, right? It's like, how many different ways can we say the same thing? And I think students sometimes, I think some students interpret that as like, oh, you just want me to write the same. I don't get that. Like, that sounds boring. But what you're doing is, by writing the same thing many different ways, right? An organicism starts to happen with the compositional process, right? Instead of like, okay, here's thread number 1, and now I'm going to write thread number 2, and I'm going to make this change, right? Well, sure, you can do it, you can write it out, manuscript, or you can improvise through it. But even if you write it out, if it keeps morphing, right? So much so that eventually, how many different ways can I say the same thing? The material kind of changes into something else completely, right? And why that is crucial is because the most difficult thing to write in composition, and I think most composers will tell you this, it's transitions. It's the transitory material. It's going from like, people come in, composers all the time, student composers, or friends of mine, like they have this great material here, and they have this great material here, and they have great material here, and in between, they're like, I just don't know how to connect these things.
Yeah.
Right? I know that they all kind of should get there, or they should all work together, right? But I can't get from point A to point B seamlessly, right? And sometimes, right, there's only like maybe 6 or 7 real ways to transition. People are like, oh, you can transition all these. Not really. You could have like a cliff where you cut off and then it's brand new material, right? Or you could have something that sort of organically morphs, right? You could do something with the rhythm and meter. You can share harmonies, right? There are all these strategies. But getting mileage out of material is sort of, part of the process. And I think the other thing to remember is it is a discipline. It's a sub-discipline of music that you have to practice like you would practice violin and you would practice piano, right? So even if you're not writing a piece, you have to be writing every day. You have to practice the craft of writing. It's the first thing I do when I wake up. I sit at the piano, I'll write a little, and I have a sketch pad that I just write ideas in, and I date them, And oftentimes, this is going to sound crazy to you, I will come back to sketches that I wrote 5 years ago, and I go, oh, this is an ensemble piece. This is a piano trio, or this is a saxophone quartet. The material, I think, informs you what it's supposed to be, but oftentimes I'm like, I'll get to that later. I'll get to that later, So I have a whole bunch of I'll get to that later. Way more than I'm probably ever going to have time in my lifetime to write, but who knows?
That's so interesting. I get to that later, and then that SpongeBob insert. Years later.
Yeah, because sometimes you're like, I'm not ready to develop this material,
Yeah.
You know, sometimes, I was writing an opera for.
I was going to ask
yeah.
about that because we never gave you enough time to talk about it.
Yeah, so I was writing this opera, and for many reasons, it took longer than I thought it was going to take. So it took me about 2 years total. And now, it's going to have a life beyond the premiere performances, and it's great. But as I was writing that, I only wrote 2 other smaller things for my own sanity because I had to. But it's hard when you're working on something that large to take on other projects. Oftentimes I will sort of push the sliders on like maybe 3 or 4 pieces. And then as a deadline gets closer, I'll finish that piece. Or another deadline gets closer, I'll finish that piece. But, that was a piece that yeah.
Yeah, maybe we can go a little bit in depth about it. So I found the year of 2014 even for an earliest part of it. Maybe you can tell
of the opera?
Yeah.
Oh, I think maybe
or was that one piece?
Yeah, I wrote a piece called Libba.
Okay.
For flute and piano.
Mm-hmm.
But that was also a commission from the Society for New Music. They had this thing called Cazenovia Counterpoint, which is a festival, and Cazenovia is one of the Finger Lakes here in central New York. And they have a summer music festival. I think it's like a week long or something like that. It's really great. And they asked me to write a piece based on Elizabeth Cotton, and I didn't know who she was yet.
Yeah, maybe elaborate a bit because I guess a lot of people will not know.
Yeah,
who she is.
so it's kind of an amazing. So you know a little bit about her now, right?
Yeah, you told a little.
Yeah, it's kind of a fascinating story because she was this woman who grew up in the South during the time of segregation in the Carolinas. African American woman, and she came up north. I can't remember how and why she ended up here, but she worked as a domestic. Someone that took care of the kids and cooked and cleaned and all that sort of stuff in Syracuse, New York, right? Just an hour from here. And amazingly, just by chance, she ended up working for the Seeger family, who, right? Who, if you don't know, is like this. Pete Seeger, founded like the great American folk songs and documented them and all that. And I guess one day they were making music in the house, and they invited Libba, and she goes, "Oh yeah, I play a little guitar too." Which she played upside down and backwards, right? Regular guitar. So she played the top strings on the bottom, and just crazy.
Why not?
Yeah, of course. And so she started playing and singing, and they're like, oh, they're sort of credited with this idea of discovering her, right? Although I think we both agree that she probably knew who she was all along, right?
Yeah, but that's a narrative of the time.
It was a really common narrative, right? But she didn't even start her career until she was 65 years old. I think she won a Grammy on her 86th or 88th birthday or something like that. I mean, it's just crazy. But I remember the first song I heard of hers, which is one of her most famous tunes. It's called Freight Train, and I think she wrote it when she was like 11 or 12 years old, right? And she sang it when she was quite elderly already, and it's just this, you hear this video, it was probably recorded in like the 70s, and there's a sincerity in there, and just, of the music, of just playing this thing that's so honest, right? Whatever that means. I know some people sort of are like sincerity, what the hell does that mean? But so I was really struck by it, and so she combines like this Appalachian type music or mountain music of the Carolinas, this folk music, with a little bit of gospel, a little bit of blues, and that's been her music. And so I was tasked with writing a piece that somehow honored her, right? And so the piece that I came up with first in 2014, I think the piece that you're talking about, this flute piano piece, used the piano and sort of in a way that made it sound like a guitar strumming.
Mm-hmm.
And the flute sort of was the melody, and then they switch roles. But the actual opera, I didn't start writing, I think, until 2020. You remember that year?
Yeah, but it probably got postponed.
Yeah. So, yeah, there was a lot of that, right? It was like, how am I writing this thing when we're not going to have, I don't see any performances in our immediate future or any readings, because oftentimes in a big work like that, you will have smaller readings of scenes before that, and there was nothing scheduled, right? And so my hand just had trouble writing anything. I sort of lacked the motivation without a deadline or a performance, but it got written.
So we also talked about if it's like an opera. I found also the description operetta.
Oh, yeah,
but
sure.
You also said it's kind of more like a musical.
Yeah.
And I guess.
Yeah.
Does it even matter?
It doesn't matter.
Not
it's
really.
Music, right? Gershwin.
Yeah, we're coming back to that.
Yeah, we have some ideas about what an opera is, right? Like this historical precedent. And so that's just to say that, if you were to hear it and see it, there are parts of it that are sung that are quite operatic, of course, and they're these trained singers. But I think the one thing that's interesting about this opera was, I have a child. I have a very young Libba, like a 12-year-old Libba, 13-year-old Libba, and that's played by a young singer who is still developing her voice, right? Who studies voice, but not trained at the same level as her older brother in this performance. This gentleman, Greg, sang with the Met. I mean, he's like this amazing singer, right? And they're both singing in the same performance. So maybe that's quite unusual as well. But the musical, I think the grammar, right? Because it's informed by gospel music, by blues, by jazz, right? African American spirituals. I have all that musical rhetoric in this opera, which we don't necessarily think of as operatic music, right? Which is, I'm shrugging, right? Like, what does that even mean?
One other thing I wanted to ask about the opera. So you wrote it with Kyle Bass, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how does that come together if you start a big project like this? What comes first, and how does it get together? How does it develop?
Right. Great question. Yeah. Well, you have to have a libretto to set, right? And so, we met and had a discussion about what we thought we wanted to do, about how long it was going to be, right? So we set up some just really basic parameters. But then, it was really up to Kyle to write text for me to work with. I wouldn't say this was a huge challenge, but he would, like I might do, if I'm writing a piece, he would write sections of them out of sequence, right? So the way that this musical was done was, it was a story of her life, starting with her commemoration at a bronze statue in a park in Syracuse, and it worked backwards to when she first started as a child and receiving her very first guitar, right? But he had given me parts of it, like maybe I got the beginning, and then I got something that he wrote somewhere in the middle, and then he got, he went back again, and then I got the end. And so it was just confusing that way, and drove me a little bit nuts, right? Because, because you want some musical continuity, right? And you're like, what sort of ideas are coming back that we hear throughout, that pervade the entire fabric of the composition, right? Like an idea of a leitmotif or something, right? For characters. So there was that. But and then we would have conversations, like if I would read some of his prose, and I would say, "Did you mean this word?" Right? Or did you want to say this? Right? Because he's speaking in a vernacular, right? And sometimes I wasn't always sure that and there were times where he said, "Oh no, that's a typo. I didn't mean to write that." But sometimes he said, "No, that's absolutely how I want it read." The most challenging part of it, by far, of writing an opera, and the thing that took them, and this will put it in perspective for you. So it took me nearly 2 years to write. It was setting the text took me the longest time, right? Because there's natural speech inflections in English, of course, but also you want it to roll in a way that feels natural, and also this in this language of sort of gospel and spirituals and blues and stuff and folk music. So that took me a long time to really do the text justice. The orchestration took me 2 weeks.
Because that's practiced, like.
Yeah, because
more an automatic process.
Yeah, the orchestration for me was because I had written up the piano vocal reduction, so I just go, I'm going to voice this. But literally, it's like an hour and 15-minute opera. I finished the whole orchestration in like 2 weeks because I had already heard it all in my head, really, how I wanted everything to go. And of course, you make some small changes as you're doing it, but just setting that text was, and there was a lot of it. There was a lot of text. And we joked around. I sent him a text message one morning. I said, as I'm finishing this thing up, just going, Kyle, there is a lot of text. And he texted me back. He goes, there's a perfect amount of text. He goes, or there's just the right amount of text. And I said, okay. Yeah. So.
That's so funny. That's like, there's so much letters and stuff from composers back in the day.
Oh yeah.
Writing with their librettists.
Yeah.
Not always very.
Yeah, it could be contentious.
Yeah.
Yeah. We had. I would say. I think Kyle would agree to this. I mean, we had a little bit of turbulence, for sure, but I kind of think you need a little bit of turbulence.
Yeah.
If everything is just kind of like smooth,
part of the artistic process.
Maybe the product isn't going to be very good. I think you need a little bit of this of sort of batting up against each other to find, hey, can we find a compromise here with this material that we are both going to feel good about in the end.
So the opera was fairly recent, right? Do you maybe have other compositions you could also tell us a little bit about?
The piece that really launched my career, whatever career it is that I have, is no other. My friend Mark Olivieri, we were hanging out, and he asked me this question, which, if I just tell you what he said, I mean, it's one of these things where you would roll your eyes and go, what? I mean, what are you talking about? But he looked at me and he said, are you writing the music that you were born to write? And yeah, right. I was like, what are you talking about, man? Like, what are you, come on. Like, what is this, transcendental kind of hocus pocus. And he goes, no, really. He goes, do you think that you're writing your music? Like the music that is in you that you were born to write? And I just remember thinking, like, holy shit. And this was like 2003. And I just thought, not really. Because I think what happens to us as composers a little bit, and even I had a great undergraduate mentor. And I still to this day, I probably learned more about writing music and being a composer from this person. His name's Dr. Brian Bevelander, than I have my entire career. He made us work. He held our feet to the fire. But he let us explore. He let us do whatever we wanted to do. Although, at that time, this fusion of sort of popular music, musical rhetorics, whether it was jazz or rock and roll or whatever, with sort of traditional concert music was just starting to gain traction. And I never felt like I had permission to necessarily do that. But this woman, named Nicola Melville, she's this New Zealand pianist. She commissioned 12 American composers. I think she commissioned me in 2003, and I was like probably the youngest and least experienced composer, and the rest of them were like, there were some like Augusta Reed Thomas was one of them. I mean, there were some big names on the CD, and then there was me, and I was happy to be included, right? And she put out this CD called Melville's Dozen, and she wanted pieces that part of the commissioning project, and it was amazing. She teaches at Carleton College in Northfield, Minnesota, and she brought all 12 composers. She flew them all up there to premiere this thing. I mean, it was like the most amazing event that I'd been a part of in my professional career. One of them, right? And the aim was to write a piece that would fill this repertory gap between like beginner and like advanced piano repertoire. Okay, so I decided to write a series of homages to 3 musicians that were really, I thought, instrumental in my own development, whether it was as a pianist or as a composer. So I wrote a homage to, the first one was homage to Aaron Copland. Mm-hmm. The second was a homage to Toru Takemitsu. And the third one was a homage to James Brown. It was called Funk for Nicky, for Nicola Melville, the pianist. And so they were the first pieces that ever really fused. Mm-hmm. And the first pieces that, because I had to write them really quickly, and I think 3 pieces were 15 minutes long, and she premiered them. They were really well received, and I've had hundreds of performances of those pieces, or like everywhere around the world. But that was the first time that I'm like, oh, if you just, I mean, it sounds kind of trite or cliche to say, but if you just write your music and you're writing something that you really believe in, you'll find an audience for it, And I thought that was a really important moment in my trajectory as a composer.
another thing I really wanted to ask about, but I couldn't word it in, is about Philip Glass.
Oh,
And
yeah.
because you mentioned him sometimes.
Yeah. I mean, that's not as big of a story as I make it out to be. I mean, really, he was at UB, University of Buffalo, my final year, and you know what's interesting, and I'm sure you've noticed this probably too, is that the people that have accomplished the most, that have kind of done it, and they had these careers, right? Philip Glass is like one of the composers, right? Who, whether or not you dig his music, he's been able to do it.
Yeah, I really like his music.
At a really high level. But I think he was just so like unassuming and just so approachable, and he's just a regular person. Duh, right? Like these are just regular people, right? I mean, I can't remember if it was him or Steve Reich one time that said, I'm the leading scholar in a field that nobody cares about. Right? So we realize that,
it's a small family.
Well, look at it this way. If you go down on the street here in Geneva, or even the city of Rochester, right? You go up to 100 random people, and you ask them who Steve Reich or Philip Glass are. I mean, how many people are going to know, right? I mean, they're two of the most prominent composers in the world, I would say, or at least the two most prominent American composers. We know who they are, right? I could name, important jazz musicians that everyone is going to know, right? But outside of, I go up to any of my friends who, play rock music and don't listen to jazz at all, they're not going to know these people, right? So I guess what I appreciated, that's sort of a human thing more than it is anything that has to do with music, is just just how humble and how modest their demeanors were, and I love that. But he did say something about pedagogy, which I found that I took, and he said his two teachers were Ravi Shankar and Nadia Boulanger, right? Who he described as a pedagogical terrorist. Okay, and of course Ravi Shankar is he was all about love and just so hey, let's play some sitar, man, And he said there are two ways to teach. He says out of fear or out of love.
Oh, that was actually his.
That was his. Yeah, and I took that to heart, because again, I think I grew up in a generation where things were a little bit more Machiavellian, right? In terms of the pedagogy, I'm sure anybody from my generation or earlier can tell you experiences that they had in conservatory that were quite harsh. People saying some really harsh things to them, but I never wanted to do that as a teacher. So I got that from Philip Glass, which I thought was pretty cool.
Yeah, that's almost really nice closing words right now. But I would like to ask about one other thing we always like to ask at the end, because we get some very funny stories out of it.
Yeah, sure.
And that is, do you have a favorite anecdote from any point of your career that you would like to share?
Yeah, it's funny because we were talking about having some music embedded in the podcast, and the piece that really kind of set me on my career, I would say, I was writing music, of course, prior to 2005, but it was 2005 or 2004 was sort of a pivotal moment because I was commissioned to write for that project, Nicola Melville, and I got a cold call from this pianist named Nicholas Phillips, who contacted me out of the blue. I'd never heard of him before. And he's like, "Hey, how you doing? This is who I am. My name's Nick Phillips, and I heard some of your music on a concert in the Twin Cities." He lives up in Wisconsin, but he was at a concert in Minneapolis, St. Paul area in Minnesota. And I'm recording a new CD, and I thought that it would be really interesting to commission one of your works. And I was like, "Well, that's cool. That sounds really interesting. Let me, just give me a day or two to think about it." And I really didn't have at that time. Maybe I don't think I had anything on the burner necessarily. I just wanted to find out who he was and how he played and what kind of piece I could write him. And turns out he's a wonderful pianist and champions a lot of new music. So he commissioned a set of pieces from me, and then we both found ourselves in Buenos Aires, Argentina, of all places, right? It was actually part of the College Music Society International Conference, and we were both down there, and he was playing a concert at the Croatian embassy in Argentina by a Croatian composer. I think I don't want to butcher his last name. I think it was Popandopoulou or something like that. Anyways, he played a concert of his music, but he also said he was going to perform one of my pieces. This piece, Hommage à Toi, that I wrote for Nick Melville. But before the concert started, the Croatian ambassador to Argentina, and here I am with all my colleagues who know me really well, and they know what I do, and they know I teach at this, small liberal arts college in central New York, and the Croatian ambassador got up there and he said, "And in the audience tonight is one of the leading composers of his generation, Mark Olivieri." And everyone just kind of turned to me and went, "Leading composer of his generation?" And, we all kind of chuckled and had a little laugh. And so for that whole week that we were there, every time we were at dinner, everyone would go, "Oh, excuse me, leading composer of his generation, Mark Olivieri, what is it that you want to order?" So it kind of became this running joke. And so now, some 10, 15 years later, we still sort of joke about that. And any time I say anything that challenges Nick, he's like, "Well, I don't want to question one of the leading composers of his generation." So that was a fun time.
I mean, you compose an opera.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Well, again, it's composition is it's a very small world, right? Of course, like the jazz world, a very small world. So when I go across the pond, I mean, you meet people and you see them and you run into like the same people, and it's amazing how small it is. So I was in Iceland, and I met someone who knew a bass player friend of mine from Ithaca. I mean, what are the chances, right? I mean, the world is so small, and so be a nice human being for sure, right?
Come back.
Yeah, it all comes back. I mean, I've actually had performers say to me, "We just want to play your music. We don't really care if necessarily how good it is. You're a nice person. We want to play your music." And I'm like, "Thanks," right? So yeah.
So what's next? What are future projects?
Yeah. So I did finish the opera, sort of. I do have to write an epilogue for it now, which kind of that was always on the burner, but now I just have to finish it. And there's just a couple of things that I need to go back and do with it, and orchestrate some stuff. And then I'm writing a saxophone quartet, and I have another sort of unorthodox piano trio for piano, viola, and flute. I had written,
Viola.
yeah, it's pretty cool. I had written this piece for my friends down in Medellin, Colombia, who have a trio down there, and They premiered it down there. They did it in Helsinki years later, and so I'm writing them another piece.
That's cool stuff.
Yeah.
We will link you in the description with where people can find you with whatever you would like to share.
Yeah.
And yes, that leaves me to advertise the podcast. If anyone's new, we will of course also link our social media, and you can find.
Yeah, and I'll tell my peeps to go listen to this interview.
Yes.
For sure. Yeah.
Yes, repost please.
Yeah, absolutely.
You can also find an email to contact us. And yes, that's it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, you're quite welcome. It's my pleasure. It was fun. It's fun.
Yeah, definitely.
Reminiscing about these, thinking about these stories again and experiences and.
Kito, ein Musikpodcast für zwischendurch.